All right, good afternoon and welcome everybody. My name is Brad Wolfenden and I'm here representing EmberSec and we'll be moderating our session today. Today's session is on the NIST Framework, Best Practices and Insights. It's a panel discussion on leveraging the framework to better manage cyber risk, improve your cyber strategy, and build a well-qualified cyber talent pipeline. A few reminders before we get started today. Your microphones have been muted and will be muted for the duration of today's webinar. With that said, we encourage you to engage with our panelists via the chat box. So we'll be going through several slides today, breaking down the framework and its application to various industries. So please do send us some questions as they come up. We have saved time at the end of today's webinar for a bit of a panel review of those questions, and we'll get to them later. And last but not least, today's session will be recorded and shared. As you know, we're here in Microsoft Teams. We will upload this recording to our YouTube channel and make that available to all of you on the line today and to future listeners. A little bit about us before I introduce our panelists. Bylight Professional IT Services was founded in 2001 as a full-service IT and cybersecurity company. Our services run the gamut of IT and cyber, including things like network architecture, engineering and design, hardware and software solutions, managed services, technical services, and consulting. Here at EmberSec, we are an advanced cybersecurity technical services and solutions organization. Three real verticals that we impact: governance, risk, and compliance is one, managed detection and response, and finally technical services. We are a third-party assessing organization for HITRUST, and our team is built of senior security researchers, operators, and intelligence professionals. Today's panelists, we are fortunate to have with us both Mr. Ken Jenkins and Laura Lee. Ken is the founder of EmberSec and CTO of cyberspace operations at Bylight. Ken is a decorated combat veteran and retired soldier. His active duty responsibilities covered operations and defense of DoD networks and battle command systems. Some of his assignments included various combat units, the Army's Criminal Investigation Command, United States Cyber Command, and at the NSA. He regularly competes in CTFs and is a technical mentor to the Cyber Patriot program. Next up, we have Miss Laura Lee. Laura is the Vice President of Cyber Training at Bylight and the product owner of the Sense portfolio. Laura is responsible for the vision and development of Bylight's cyber training and exercise product portfolio. In this role, she is leading product development teams that are shifting the paradigm for cybersecurity teaching, training, and testing by focus on active, continuous learning driven by the user. Laura brings an exceptional record of leadership in the field of cyber and previously was responsible for directing the research and development at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. Today's agenda, quick snapshot of what we'll be diving into throughout the session. We will get things started with a brief overview of the NIST framework itself, running through the categories and the functions, give you a little bit of a timeline and the history. Following that, we will jump into NIST as a best practice, applying the framework to the commercial space as well as within academia. We will then move into some success stories and talk about how NIST has impacted operations and led to some related processes and tools and things like that in practice. And then we will wrap today with a panel discussion and getting to your Q&As. So with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Ken Jenkins to jump in.
Hey, thanks, Brad. Appreciate it. So before we get started, I want to jump into like how the rest of the webinar will go. So I'll bring a bit of operational focus to the material I'll be covering, and then Laura will provide a bit on a bit more from an academic approach based on her years of experience teaching the NIST framework in academia. So the NIST framework, it's a cybersecurity framework. Of note, it is a voluntary framework, but it consists of standards, guidelines, best practices These best practices were, came from years of collaboration by industry experts. I'll talk about that a little more as we go. And it also helps organizations really focus on reducing risk. So as I've conducted cyber operations over the years, I've witnessed organizations that were very compliant, whether it be things regulating them such as PCI, maybe it's high trust, maybe it's ISO 27001, just many frameworks out there that they do help secure an environment, but they don't necessarily address risk the same way that NIST does. So what I like about NIST, it really helps you quantify your risk and then puts it in a really manageable framework that you can actually carry that out. Next slide. So NIST is a rather young framework. I mean, it originated in 2013, but the goal really in 2013 was to strengthen cybersecurity in federal networks and critical infrastructure. This was done, one of the main tenets of creating the framework is to increase threat information sharing and looking for ways to reduce risk to critical infrastructure. So between 2013 and I would say 2016, when really version 1.1 went into draft, there was a lot of movement. And it really started with lots of collaboration, which consisted of requests for information to industry, and then when the draft framework was put in place, there was a lot of requests for comments from the governing body to industry on the framework. So over thousands of responses really help inform the framework to kind of bring it to where it is today. Another thing is there's constant workshops with industry experts to keep evolving the framework. As you see, it's about 7 years old now, and there's a massive adoption increasing in the framework, and it's been translated to multiple languages. Next slide. So this framework, as it relates to applications, like practical application, is really helps with managing risk. There's tiers for defining how you quantify your risk, and then how do you get to an optimal level of risk, whether it's through risk reduction, risk transference, risk avoidance. The framework really helps you with that. It also fosters communication, meaning you can talk across the industry, you can talk across your organization. There is a lexicon and a shared vocabulary across the framework that the industry understands, and it makes it easier for disparate sectors and just different business verticals to have these conversations about how to counter cybersecurity risks. One thing I truly like about the framework is the ability to scale. You could take this to a very small organization or a couple hundred employees, or a global organization that has hundreds of thousands employees and locations and whatnot. I would say it's budget agnostic, whether it's a small budget or a very large budget. There's feasibility in how you implement the framework, regardless of budget. Unlike some of the other, well, I'll get to that in a moment. Also, when you start recruiting and conducting hiring, the taxonomy, again, the lexicon, is very common across the functions, the positions. I'll go over some of the positions here shortly, but it's very easy to kind of understand what the position description is, or what it should be written for the work role you may have, and then Laura will touch on it a bit, is with training. How do you train these personnel and teams? Next slide. So the framework consists of 5 different pieces or portions of the framework, and it's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Many frameworks have this, but what I really like from an operational standpoint is the ability to respond to detect and respond. So you're not just saying you must do this based on compliance reasons. You're also exercising the framework and saying, hey, this is here to help us raise the cost of the adversary, and keep, help quantify our risks. And we do that through being able to detect it and then being able to respond effectively. So there's portions of the framework to help you do that. So I think that's really the value proposition across, where NIST where the NIST framework really kind of excels is focusing on the practical application and technical abilities to be able to do that. Next slide. So there are a lot of frameworks that have references or loosely tie back to NIST. Those consist of the CIS Top 20, COBIT, ISO 27001, and NIST Special Publication 800-53, and then ISO 62443. There's quite a bit of overlap, and with NIST also it refers to some of those references from those frameworks as well. So it encompasses quite a bit. It's, I would say it's like one framework to rule them all. This industry agnostic, and within the framework, there's 5 functions, 23 categories, 108 subcategories, and as you go through each of the portions of the framework, it's easily digestible. It's really, you don't have to have a degree in cybersecurity to really kind of understand what the framework is and how you roll it out based on the size of your organization. Next slide. So a practical application, if you go into, if you could build out a security operations center, NIST framework would say this is kind of how it looks. Well, oddly enough, in organizations that I've been a part of red teaming or penetration testing or doing any kind of purple teaming, this is how majority of the security operations centers look. And some of this, at some organizations, this is by happenstance, other it's by best practice, and then some are very deliberate. Say, hey, we're using this cybersecurity framework to build out our security operations. So I'll just kind of dive in here real quickly. So the SOC director, that's a person that understands how to put all this together, has years of experience in intelligence operations, security operations, and security service, and generally has a great understanding of information technology and service delivery. So the intelligence portion of the SOC, that's usually someone that's looking early for attack sensing and warnings, indicators of compromise, conducting analysis, see how it's applicable to the organization, and then informing operations, security operations, and the security services. And then vulnerability analysis is where you really conduct a research to see where vulnerabilities could exist, whether that's finding information from other organizations, other circular reporting, or actually conducting your own threat research. And then you have operations. That's really where your continuous monitoring, some call it managed detection response, some call it security operations, others call it continuous monitoring, but that's really fits into this bucket. And that consists of investigations. This is where you may have an anomaly on a network or something doesn't look right. So your goal is to rule it out, whether it's a false positive, false negative, whether it's true positive, false positive. Then you have your forensics team that can take a deeper dive into understanding what exactly happened. Then you have your malware team that can actually reverse the malware, conduct analysis, potentially derive IOCs from their analysis. And then finally, you have your incident response team that once an event turns to an incident, they can help respond and go through their process. And then you have your continuous monitoring team that really kind of focuses across all of your enterprise, looking at many data sources and leveraging SIMs and other signatures, machine learning, behavioral analytics, and then just analysis with the rest of the operations team. Then you have your security operations. This is really where your solutions are deployed, and you're watching. You have these solutions in place that consist of countermeasures and other types of malware detection or vulnerability management. And then you have your security services. That's just really your operations and understanding your governance, risk, compliance, and auditing, your program management over the entire SOC, and your processes and procedures that are documented across the 4 distinct functions here in the SOC. So if you were to go to a major security operations center, say maybe a Fortune 500, maybe a bank, this framework would look very similar to what they have deployed. And this can be scaled up or down based on your threat model and based on your budget. Next slide. Excuse me. So I want to transition over to Laura now. Laura will take you through the NIST framework and, from an academic perspective, and she'll kind of show how all these things kind of tie together and, how you can really implement the cybersecurity framework best practice. Laura?
Thanks, Ken. So as a teacher working with students and faculty on how do we address cybersecurity with all these openings and gaps of needing more people in the field, it can be quite daunting. Students are saying, what do I take? Universities are saying, what do we teach? So I like the NIST framework, and I like the chart here that Ken walked through, because it is real world. We want people to be trained to do these jobs and to get out in the workforce ready to go, up with a very applied understanding. So in looking at this chart, which again is an overview of how a NIST framework is implemented, whether you're a very small team of 1, you have to do all of this, or a very large team of 75 or 250 in some of the corporations that we've worked with, they have this layout. From an academic perspective, we put these extra sort of boxes of disciplines around it. So in the far right, which is where the IT programs really stood up and have grown into cybersecurity, that's the HARDEN group. That's the group that's trying to harden everything, whether it's a computer or a network device or a camera, whatever's on the enterprise connected in, they need to harden that and ensure that it is protected to the best ability. The group in the middle, they have to monitor everything, whether it's the servers, whether it's Windows or Linux hosts, or the cameras, or the fish tank, whatever's connected to the internet has to be monitored, and that team does that, and there's various work roles involved in that. And then on the far left is the pursuit team, as we labeled it. It's really the group that's doing the forensics, they're doing support to the law enforcement. Typically we call this kind of the hunt team. Their job is to find the adversaries that are probably already operating on the network, understanding where the vulnerabilities might be, where the attackers may hide, and then of course reacting and responding to those. So that's the pursuit team. And then the coordinate team is really all those leads plus the director. They're looking both inward at the team, directing it, and outward in the community to do the information sharing and response to these incidents. So from an academic perspective, we try to take the NIST framework and break it up, and I'll talk really about the 3 technical groups: harden, monitor, pursue, what it means to get a career in that, how we can help prepare in universities or other training programs so they can come into these areas. Next chart. So first I'll talk about the hardened subdiscipline. The way to look at this chart is all the boxes are the courses that are necessary for anyone working in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And then we color coded them for these subdisciplines. So all the ones in red apply to the hardened subdiscipline. Let me orient you down to the bottom right, which are the different work roles. So if you're looking at the NIST Cybersecurity Workforce Framework, which defines the types of work roles within the US government, there'll be things like a cyber defense infrastructure support specialist, or security control assessor, or security architect, vulnerability assessment analyst. They have defined work roles that help organizations hire people and allow people to be able to transfer from one organization to another organization with a common understanding of what is, for example, a vulnerability assessment analyst. So in preparing people for this field, I think the better approach, at least we've seen in both academic and then real world when people get out in the field, it's great for them to focus in a subdiscipline. So if you take courses in the boxes outlined in red with the prerequisites going from left to right, you can work in multiple different work roles and sort of have a career as that evolves. So a hardened subdiscipline has to have that foundation, Windows, Linux, scripting, fundamentals. In the middle side, that leads to a strong understanding of various scripting languages in Python and PowerShell. They have to understand Linux and Windows well. They have to identify the key terrain and adversaries on the network. Basically, they're get into the vulnerability side of offensive operations, and then on the far right red column, that's where they apply themselves in terms of protecting the networks with firewalls or hardening the Active Directory to ensure it's difficult for adversaries to control, and basic hunting protection mechanisms. So all of these can lead to programs in academic institutions and get people ready for those work roles. Next chart. So this is similar but different courses as you move into the monitor. So folks that are monitoring will come out typically as a cyber defense analyst or a cyber defense incident responder. Those are related, but incident responder can go through the following the incident, going through bringing the incident to a close, and through forensics, where cyber defense analyst is typically an entry-level role where they're monitoring the network and elevating things from events to possible incidents. We also see a lot of software developers in this field. They're writing tools that help you deal with big data, because that's what monitoring is about, gathering all the data and finding things useful in it. So we see software developers and security architects. They start with the same foundation, but they have to be heavy in scripting and Python and PowerShell. They have to understand the network, and they typically are involved at the packet analysis level through intrusion detection, so that they can move into network security monitoring, which is finding threats and tracking them through the incident. Next slide. And the last one I'll cover will be pursue. Remember, this is really the hunt group that finds the adversaries on the networks and takes them through to forensics analysis and works with the law enforcement. So they have to be, this is probably the hardest technical subdiscipline to teach and to get the real world experience in, because you have to have a lot of skills in understanding the different platforms in Windows and Linux at the advanced level, understand where the adversaries are hiding, be able to reverse engineer, do malware analysis, and even find rootkits. So this is an advanced track for folks that really want to get into the underpinnings of the different components on the network. Next slide. So we like to have students be taught of the NIST framework right away. It is a really good reference, as Ken mentioned, pulling the details across a lot of different standards internationally together. And it kind of simplifies it into identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. You don't miss anything if you can follow those things. And so what we do is, when we're working through the disciplines, you can see those on the left-hand side, we walk them through kind of what the careers are like, what the tasks are like as they work in the NIST framework for these different subdisciplines. The ones in bold are the most active subdiscipline in that area of the NIST framework. So let me walk you through that for a minute. So if someone that's doing hardening in that and the different work roles that are aligned with that, they will have to identify all the assets, users, software, hardware, whatever's on the network. They have to figure out what the key terrain is. They are bold and very active in the protect phase, so they have to recommend the policies and protection measures. Now, when you move into detect, they're helping respond and figuring out, like, why did this happen? What, where was our protection weak, allowing an incident to occur? But the detect phase is very big on monitor. They're aggregating the data, they're responding and triage. When you move into the response phase, now the emphasis shifts to the pursuit team, who needs to figure out what the options are, how are we going to handle this, and balance that with the forensics so that we can prosecute for these incidents. So they're leading the charge and respond, but the other subdisciplines have a role as well in that phase. And then in recovery, the lead, the coordinate role is working to share those findings with the community and with their organization. So if you look at this, NIST is easy to get your arms around. from a corporate perspective, understand what programs you need to have. It's a great reference, I think, for academia to figure out what are the careers, what should we do, and how do these work roles all work together in that SOC that Ken showed? How do the work roles work together to support and execute the NIST framework? Next slide. We're going to talk about a few success stories, and I'll talk about the University of Chicago. I liked what the University of Chicago said about the NIST framework because they're looking at it as adopting it the way that so they can protect the university. So universities have a big challenge in their network. They have a lot of risks because you're dealing with different organizations doing research, lots of students, a lot of things happening on the network that makes them a big target. And they like to adopt the NIST framework because it's a way of communicating across all the different groups in the university. I think you don't see a lot of success stories in where I want them to go, which is what I talked about of how to use NIST to develop more of the career pathways for students and the different courses they teach, but we're making some progress there too. Let me turn it back over to Ken to talk about some of the other success stories.
Thanks, Laura. So the Israeli National Cyber Director in 2012 established their Israeli National Cyber Directorate, and it's really kind of focused on helping commercial entities, private companies to defend themselves better. The real goal is to be able to counter cyber threats and reduce risk as much as possible. So they utilize NIST to help build their cyber defense methodology, also known as ICDM. So it was kind of one of the outputs that did help with that. So they're really having a resurgence with defending private companies and non-government entities. So big transition for them utilizing this. A third one, a little smaller, is a National Restaurant Association. So they published a Cybersecurity 101 toolkit and sent it out to restaurant operators. And it really is focused on the 5 functions that we showed above in NIST, and it really helped to assist restaurant operators because their restaurant operators aren't necessarily governed by any particular cybersecurity framework or framework that requires them to take certain actions. So this to me is a really good starting point for the association to really start focusing on these things. I mean, they still are required to take actions based on PCI and handling of private identifiable information, but really, as far as securing themselves, they weren't. There's no overarching requirement. So this is a really good first step. So let me turn it back over to Brad real quick, and we can have some further panel discussion. Brad?
Yeah, great, Ken. Thank you, and thanks to you too, Laura. It's always nice to hear about success stories, and I know a lot of the work that we've done across both the private and public sector and around the NIST framework comes out in these kinds of conversations. And Laura, I know your background in the academic space has been very well received, and some coursework that you've designed and delivered has been very impressive. So appreciate you all taking the time this afternoon to share some of your experience with us. Before we get into the panel discussion, and I know we've gotten a couple of questions in on the line, so we'll get to those as well. Just to review a few of the key takeaways. First, NIST, as we've shared, and as many of you know, is an international standard. It ties to many other frameworks, and really in that way is quite applicable to all kinds of industries, all kinds of organizations in terms of size and things like that. Second of all, it does apply both to commercial and academia. I think sometimes these frameworks tend to be given a connotation that is somewhat government specific, but in sort of laying the NIST framework on top of commercial cybersecurity programs and academic degree programs and things like that, you can find some success there. Of course, it is scalable for cyber teams of any size. Both Laura and Ken kind of touched on this. Whether you're a team of 1 or a team of 250, you can really kind of take that kind of longer pole view of the NIST framework and use it to ensure that you're covering all of your bases, and that you're setting your organization up for success in a way that you have a pretty good idea of the risk, how to manage it, how your tools and talents are working together to strengthen your posture. And then last but not least, the success stories demonstrate that the NIST framework is more about the how than the what. As Ken mentioned early on in today's session, I think some other frameworks that folks might be more used to or equally used to, they're really kind of designed with mandated results in mind, whereas the NIST framework presents a bit more of kind of suggestions. And it's more outcome driven than it is necessarily mandating results. So with that, we will move into a panel discussion. Ken, Laura, did either of you have any closing comments, or should we jump straight to some of these questions that are coming in?
Yeah, let's jump to the questions. I want to hear what people are interested in.
Okay, great. Well, we have a few now. Those of you that are on the line, feel free. Now would be a good time to continue to lob those our way. The first one I'm going to throw your way, Ken. This one is: being cyber safe and resilient to adversaries is overwhelming and expensive. What is your advice for a small business that is just starting out, and what are some of the first steps we would need to take to establish a strong foundation?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Good question. So, small companies, obviously, when I think about how to advise them, I say, what is their budget? What are the resources they have available as far as personnel, skill sets, and what is their understanding? What is their current business model? After you kind of discover that, then you look at, well, what are the risks and threats that they have to counter? For a small company, let's say maybe a legal firm, they may not have the same threat model that a large bank would have. So really look to focus on what that is first, and then I really like the CIS top 20 if you're first starting out and you haven't taken any steps. Just understanding the top 20, but really NIST is very applicable in this situation. So things like understanding your hardware inventory, your software inventory, and then dropping all the way down to the lower priority controls, the penetration testing and instant response. Those are all things you need to look at. But I think the biggest one is having the discussion on, action across the company. What do we think our problems are? What do we think our risks or threats are? And then how do we counter those with the NIST framework?
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. Couple more have come in here. Laura, this one is sort of in reference to one of the slides you presented, so I'll lob it your way. I like how you've broken down the NIST framework into harden, monitor, pursue, coordinate. Can you share some thoughts on the technical and soft skills that are most important for each of those roles?
Yes, for all roles, I think a strong foundation. So is important. If they do one thing, is to get the foundation right, meaning they understand the network and security fundamentals. They understand how packets and how the internet's formed. Every role has to have that foundational understanding. One thing we've noticed is that people that really excel also have a solid scripting background, so that they can understand how things propagate on the network. They can also jump out of their tools and do things quickly by being able to script things to gather the information or respond. And so those skills we think everybody should have from a technical perspective. On the soft skill side, they definitely have to be part of a team. It seems to counter people say cyber are a bunch of introverts sitting around staring at computers, and there's certainly some of that from the standpoint of there's a lot of hard work and details, and you are staring at a computer screen a lot. But to be successful, you have to really do that full NIST framework, that single chart that Ken showed about all the things that have to be done. And if you don't operate as a team, then the adversary can take advantage of those gaps. So a way to think about it is an incident starts somewhere. And if the analyst looks at that and stays in his own world and doesn't communicate in a way that others can join in, that it's ineffective. So you have to be able to say, look, I found this, and bring other people in and pass that information to those that need it. So it has to be a much more active team-based role. We like to say like a basketball team, so that they're moving hard and fast, but working together. So teamwork and communication are important things we look for.
Yeah, great. Wonderful. I know you've recently done some research on looking at some of the ways individuals process information and some of their sort of inherent personality characteristics and things that seem to align them with roles in cybersecurity that might be a more natural fit. So very cool stuff. Looks like we have one more here, unless others come in. I do want to get to this question though, and probably for both of you. So I'll start with Ken and then bounce to Laura. Do either of you have any comments? I know there were a couple already mentioned, but do you see the NIST framework being applied to or used in specific sectors like healthcare or energy, oil and gas?
So Brad, I'll take a shot at it. So yes, absolutely. So, you know, there was the few examples we showed above with academia, with foreign governments, and with the Restaurant Association. You know, what I really see is spin-offs of the framework. You know, I mentioned high trust earlier. So a lot of the controls within the domains within high trust, you know, are based on NIST controls. So it maybe not directly applicable, saying, hey, we decided to go with NIST framework, but some of the frameworks they're associated with or predominant in their sector are generally based off of NIST. Laura?
Thanks. So we certainly see it in the financial sector. They've been adopting it since the beginning because quite frankly, they had to. Due to regulations, they had to perform, you know, different audits and training and exercises related to cybersecurity. So they got on board fairly quickly. In contrast, energy sector is all over the place. You get some very large corporations that they understand how some of the attackers have been effective in shutting down large companies like Saudi Aramco. So they're on board to adopt things like the NIST framework, but there's also a lot of small companies, you know, that are not yet adopting it because they don't have to. There's no regulation that says they do, and probably until they have, they're going to be saying, "Oh, I just have other things to do." So we are seeing it increasing adoption. I think there's tools and capabilities that make it simple for small, even very small organizations to consider. I think it's well written, and hopefully we'll see everyone taking this on as they're now certainly aware of all the threats and breaches that are happening all the time. And I think ransomware really woke up a lot of folks going, look, I may be a small business, but if I don't do the cybersecurity, I could be out of business.
Yeah. Good point. Thank you. And makes me think about some of the more recent regulations, whether it's GDPR or CCPA, some of those mandated regulations that are coming out that do impose some relatively severe penalties to businesses that aren't necessarily taking the precautions, and frameworks like what NIST has provided can certainly help folks kind of figure out their path to maintaining compliance and meeting some of those regulations. So it does not look like any other questions have come in at this point. So I think we will go ahead and conclude today's session. In doing so, I really want to thank both Ken and Laura for your time, for your energy, for your expertise. Really appreciate the hard work that you all put into preparing these slides and sharing that with our audience. And before we do depart, just a reminder, today's session was recorded. It will be shared. That will be shared to you directly via email. Those of you that registered, others that would be interested can find the recording of today's session on our YouTube channel. We encourage you to reach out via email that is on the screen now, info@embercybersecurity.com. You're more than welcome to follow up with us directly with any questions, comments. Feedback is always welcome. And then last but not least, if you're not already doing so, please find us on either LinkedIn or Twitter. We have a relatively active social presence Quite a few blogs and things available on our website, infographics, white papers, and whatnot. So please do engage with us there. And again, thanks for joining us today. We'll hope to see you on our next webinar, and have a wonderful rest of your week and a safe and enjoyable 4th of July holiday.
Thanks, Brad.